I'm 28 years old, and I just bought my first house with cash. Not a loan, not a mortgage, cash. And when my father called to congratulate me last week, the first words out of my mouth weren't thank you. They were, remember when you told me I wasn't worth a $300 textbook investment? Because I sure do. And that moment, that single moment of being denied something so basic while watching my brother get his fourth car co-signed, changed everything about how I see family, money, and my own worth. If you've ever been the unfavored child, if you've ever watched a sibling get everything while you got nothing, if you've ever been told to be grateful for scraps while someone else got the whole meal, this story is for you. Because what happened to me wasn't just about textbooks or cars. It was about a pattern so deep, so systematic, that it took me years to even recognize it was happening. My name is Sarah, and I'm the middle child in a family of 3. My older sister Emma moved across the country after college and barely speaks to us anymore, something I understand now in ways I couldn't then. My younger brother Jake has always been the golden child, though it took me embarrassingly long to see it. Growing up, I thought I was just unlucky. I thought I was asking for too much. I thought maybe I wasn't trying hard enough to earn what came so easily to everyone else. The pattern started early, but like most systematic family dysfunction, it was subtle enough that I convinced myself I was imagining it. When Jake wanted guitar lessons at age 10, Dad immediately signed him up for the premium package at the music store downtown, $60 a month, which was significant money for our middle-class family in 2003. When I asked for art classes that same year, I was told we couldn't afford extracurriculars for everyone, and maybe I could practice drawing with library books instead. When Jake decided he wanted to play baseball, Dad bought him a complete Wilson equipment set that cost over $200. The glove alone was $80. I remember because I was with them at the sporting goods store, watching Dad hand over his credit card without hesitation, while I held a $20 clearance art set I'd been begging for months. Dad looked at my art supplies and shook his head, explaining that baseball equipment was an investment in Jake's future, while art supplies were just something I'd use up and throw away. I learned to make myself smaller after that. I learned to ask for less, to need less, to expect less. When other kids got new clothes for school, I got Emma's hand-me-downs and told myself I was being environmentally conscious. When Jake got a new laptop for his freshman year of high school because his grades were good, I kept using the family computer we'd had since 2001, the one that took 10 minutes to boot up and crashed every time I tried to run more than one program. But I was a good kid. I got straight A's all through high school, I volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend, I babysat neighbor kids to earn my own spending money. I thought if I was good enough, smart enough, helpful enough, things would even out. I thought my parents were just waiting for me to prove myself worthy of the same investment they made in Jake so effortlessly. The college years were when the pattern became impossible to ignore, though I still tried. Jake was 2 years behind me, but somehow his college plans were being discussed and funded while I was still figuring out how to pay for mine. Dad co-signed a student loan for my tuition, but only after making me promise to pay him back for any interest charges that accumulated. The message was clear: this is a burden, not an investment. Meanwhile, Jake's college fund had been growing since he was born. Not a massive amount, but enough to cover his first year completely. When I asked why I didn't have a college fund, Mom explained that they'd started saving differently by the time Jake came along, as if 7 years of my childhood simply hadn't existed in their financial planning. I worked 25 hours a week throughout college, in addition to carrying a full course load and maintaining a 3.8 GPA. I worked in the campus bookstore, at a local restaurant on weekends, and did tutoring whenever I could find students who needed help. The money went to everything my student loans didn't cover: textbooks, lab fees, parking passes, the endless small expenses that add up to hundreds every semester. Jake, meanwhile, was having the typical college experience. He joined a fraternity, went to spring break in Cancun, and called home for money whenever he needed it. And he always got it. Dad would transfer money to his account with the same casual ease he'd shown buying that baseball equipment years earlier. The textbook incident happened during my junior year, in the spring semester of 2018. I was taking advanced organic chemistry, and the required textbook cost $320. I'd already spent my textbook budget for the semester, and my bank account had $47 until my next paycheck. I called home on a Tuesday evening, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. Dad's response was immediate and final. He told me that $300 was too much to spend on a single book, that I should find a used copy or borrow one from the library. When I explained that the library only had 2 copies for a class of 30 students and that the book came with access codes required for homework that couldn't be shared, he suggested I consider whether I really needed to take such an expensive class. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes. He didn't ask about my grades in the class, didn't ask about my overall academic performance, didn't ask whether this course was required for my major. He simply decided that $320 was too much to invest in my education, and that was the end of the discussion. I hung up and sat in my dorm room, staring at the syllabus that clearly stated the textbook was mandatory for passing the course. I felt something shift inside me that night, a recognition that I'd been trying to avoid for years. This wasn't about money. Dad had money. This was about priorities, and I simply wasn't one of them. I ended up borrowing the money from my roommate's mom, who insisted it wasn't a loan but a gift when she heard what had happened. Mrs. Peterson had known me for 2 years by then, had watched me study while my roommate partied, had seen me leave for work early on Saturday mornings while other kids slept off their Friday nights. She looked genuinely confused when I told her my father had refused to help with textbooks, as if she couldn't reconcile what she knew about my character with what she was hearing about my family's support. That conversation with Mrs. Peterson was the first time I'd ever heard an adult validate what I was experiencing. She didn't tell me my parents were doing their best or that money was tight for everyone. She looked me in the eye and said it seemed unfair that I was working so hard while carrying such a heavy financial burden alone. Her simple acknowledgement of the unfairness made me realize I wasn't crazy, wasn't ungrateful, wasn't asking for too much. 2 months later, Jake called home asking Dad to co-sign his 4th car loan. Not his first, his 4th. He'd had a Honda Civic in high school that he'd crashed sophomore year. Dad immediately bought him a used Toyota Camry to replace it. Junior year, Jake decided he wanted something sportier, so Dad co-signed a loan for a Mustang with a $400 monthly payment. Now, as a college senior, Jake had decided he needed something more reliable for job interviews and wanted to trade in the Mustang for a brand new Honda Accord. I found out about the car situation when I called home the week after Dad had co-signed Jake's loan. Mom mentioned it casually, as if co-signing a $28,000 car loan was as routine as buying groceries. She was excited about Jake's new car, describing the heated seats and backup camera like they were talking about a family vacation instead of a massive financial commitment. The contrast was so stark, so undeniable, that I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience during that phone call. $320 for textbooks that would directly impact my education and career prospects? Too expensive, not worth it, find another way. $28,000 for Jake's 4th car in 6 years, a car that was purely a want rather than a need. Absolutely, whatever Jake needs, family supports family. I didn't say anything during that call. I listened to Mom talk about Jake's car, asked appropriate questions, and congratulated him when she handed him the phone. But after I hung up, I sat in my apartment and wrote down everything I could remember about the financial support each of us had received over the years. The list was devastating in its clarity. Jake's financial support from our parents, car insurance continuously paid from age 16 to 23, 4 cars either purchased outright or co-signed, college fund that covered his first year completely, spring break trips funded, fraternity fees paid, semester abroad program costs covered, graduate school application fees paid, interview travel expenses covered. My financial support from our parents, student loan co-signed with requirement to pay back any interest, textbook request denied, work-study job required throughout college, spring break spent working double shifts, graduate school applications paid for with my own money, interview travel costs covered by my own savings. Emma's financial support, almost identical to mine, which explained why she'd moved across the country and maintained minimal contact. The pattern wasn't subtle anymore. It was systematic, consistent, and completely intentional. Jake was the investment. Emma and I were expenses to be minimized. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in chemical engineering and was accepted to 3 top graduate programs. Dad's response to my acceptance letters was proud but measured, as if my achievements were expected rather than celebrated. When Jake graduated 6 months later with a 2.7 GPA in business administration, the family threw a graduation party that cost more than my entire senior year textbook budget. Graduate school was where I finally stopped asking for anything. I earned a full teaching assistantship that covered tuition and provided a modest stipend. I lived in a studio apartment that cost $400 a month, shopped at Aldi, and learned to cook everything from scratch because eating out wasn't an option. I was determined to prove that I could succeed without anyone's help, since help clearly wasn't available anyway. Jake, meanwhile, moved back home after graduation and spent 6 months looking for the perfect job while Dad continued paying his car insurance, phone bill, and giving him spending money for social activities. When Jake finally found an entry-level marketing position, Dad helped him put together a security deposit and first month's rent for a nice apartment downtown. The assistance was given freely, without conditions, without the lectures about financial responsibility that had accompanied every dollar I'd ever asked for. I finished my master's degree in 18 months instead of the typical 2 years, working 60-hour weeks between my research, teaching responsibilities, and a weekend job I'd picked up to supplement my stipend. My thesis advisor, Dr. Martinez, was impressed enough with my work to recommend me for a PhD program with full funding, but also concerned about my health and work-life balance. Dr. Martinez was the second adult who'd ever directly addressed what she saw as unfair treatment in my life. She'd met my parents at graduation and noticed the difference in how they spoke about my achievements versus Jake's plans. Her observation was gentle but pointed. It seemed like I was working much harder than necessary to prove something that should have been evident from my consistent performance. That conversation led me to start therapy for the first time. Dr. Williams helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't normal sibling rivalry or family financial constraints. It was favoritism so systematic that it had shaped my entire sense of self-worth around earning what other people received simply by existing. The therapy sessions were revelatory in ways I hadn't expected. I learned that children who grow up as the unfavored child often develop what Dr. Williams called earned worth syndrome. The belief that love, support, and basic consideration must be earned through perfect behavior and exceptional achievement. Jake had learned that he was inherently worthy of support and investment. I had learned that I might become worthy if I worked hard enough and achieved enough. Understanding the dynamic didn't immediately fix it, but it gave me language for what had happened and permission to stop trying to earn something that should have been freely given. More importantly, it helped me recognize that my parents' treatment of me reflected their limitations, not my worth. I decided to pursue the PhD program Dr. Martinez had recommended at a university 800 miles from home. The distance was intentional. I needed space to figure out who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to prove myself worthy of basic family support. Doctoral research suited me perfectly. I was already accustomed to working alone, to finding solutions independently, to persisting through setbacks without external encouragement. My research focused on developing more efficient catalytic processes for pharmaceutical manufacturing, work that combined my analytical skills with a practical application that could help people. For 3 years, I barely spoke to my family beyond holiday phone calls and brief updates on my progress. I wasn't angry anymore, just exhausted by the emotional labor of maintaining relationships where my value was consistently questioned. Jake, meanwhile, had gotten engaged to his college girlfriend and was planning a wedding that Dad was proudly funding to the tune of $35,000. The wedding planning process revealed the family dynamics in ways that would have been comical if they weren't so painful. Every detail of Jake's wedding was treated as a family priority. Mom took vacation days to go dress shopping with Jake's fiancé. Dad researched vendors and negotiated contracts. They attended cake tastings and venue tours with the enthusiasm of people planning their own celebration. When I was invited to be a bridesmaid, the expectation was that I would pay for my own dress, shoes, hair, makeup, and travel expenses, while also contributing to the bachelorette party and wedding shower costs. The bridesmaid dress alone cost $250, nearly as much as the textbook Dad had refused to buy years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. I attended the wedding because I didn't want to create family drama, but I watched the celebration with the detached perspective that therapy had given me. Dad's speech talked about how proud he was to have raised such a successful son, how Jake represented everything he'd hoped for in a child. He talked about the investment he and Mom had made in Jake's future and how that investment was paying off in Jake's career success and personal happiness. There was no mention of Emma, who hadn't been able to afford the trip home. There was no mention of me, standing 10 feet away in the bridesmaid dress I'd bought with money I'd earned from weekend tutoring sessions. The speech lasted 8 minutes and focused entirely on Jake's achievements, most of which had been facilitated by the same financial support that had been denied to Emma and me. After the wedding, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible during my undergraduate years. I stopped trying to maintain the relationship, not with anger or dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet recognition that I was investing emotional energy in people who had never invested equally in me. I finished my PhD 2 years later with a dissertation that earned recognition from the American Chemical Society. My research had led to 3 published papers in high-impact journals and a patent application that showed commercial promise. Dr. Martinez helped me secure a position with a pharmaceutical company that offered a starting salary higher than Dad's income after 30 years in his field. The job came with relocation assistance, a signing bonus, and benefits that included education reimbursement for additional certifications. For the first time in my life, I had financial security that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or support. I rented a beautiful apartment, bought a reliable car with cash, and started contributing to a retirement account like a normal adult who'd always had the privilege of thinking beyond immediate survival. I didn't tell my family about the job until after I'd already started. When I finally called to share the news, Mom's first question wasn't congratulations on my achievement. It was whether I'd be able to visit more often now that I had a good job, as if my previous absence had been a choice rather than a necessity. Dad's response was more telling. He seemed surprised that I'd been able to secure such a prestigious position, as if my academic achievements over the past decade had been lucky accidents rather than the result of consistent excellence. He asked several questions about the company's stability and whether I was sure I was qualified for such a high-level role, concerns he'd never expressed about any of Jake's career moves. The conversation lasted 15 minutes and ended with Dad mentioning that Jake and his wife were having some financial difficulties adjusting to married life, and wasn't it nice that I was finally in a position to help family when needed? The expectation was clear. Now that I had achieved financial stability despite their lack of support, I should be grateful for the opportunity to support the family member who had always received everything easily. I hung up that phone call with complete clarity about my boundaries. I would maintain polite contact with my parents, but I would not be anyone's backup plan after being dismissed as a priority for 26 years. I would not fund Jake's lifestyle choices after watching him receive every advantage while I received every obstacle. The clarity was liberating in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in my adult life, I could make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what I needed to prove. I could spend money on things I enjoyed rather than just things I required. I could plan for the future rather than just survive the present. I used my signing bonus to take a vacation to Europe, something I'd dreamed about since college but never been able to afford. I bought art supplies and started painting again for the first time since high school. I joined a hiking club and made friends who knew nothing about my family dynamics, people who liked me simply for who I was rather than what I could achieve or provide. 6 months into my new job, my research team made a breakthrough that led to a process improvement worth millions of dollars in manufacturing savings. The company rewarded the team with bonuses and fast-tracked several of us for promotion consideration. My bonus was more money than I'd lived on during entire years of graduate school. For the first time, I had enough financial security to consider buying a house. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because I wanted a place that was completely mine, where I could make decisions without considering anyone else's opinions or approval. I spent 3 months looking at properties, working with a real estate agent who treated me like a serious buyer despite my age. The house I found was a small craftsman bungalow with original hardwood floors, a kitchen that needed updating, and a backyard perfect for the garden I'd always wanted. The asking price was within my budget, and the inspection revealed only minor issues that I could handle over time. For the first time in my life, I was making a major decision purely based on what I wanted, rather than what I could afford or what others expected. I made an offer that was accepted, secured a mortgage with terms that reflected my excellent credit and stable income, and scheduled a closing date 6 weeks out. The process was straightforward because I'd prepared thoroughly, saved appropriately, and approached the purchase as an adult transaction rather than a family negotiation. 2 weeks before closing, Jake called me for the first time in 8 months. He'd never called me directly before, All our communication had been through Mom or during family gatherings. His tone was friendly but tentative, as if he wasn't sure how to talk to me without parental mediation. The conversation started with small talk about work and weather, but gradually moved toward what I suspected was his real purpose. Jake and his wife were struggling with credit card debt from their wedding and honeymoon, and their car payments were higher than they'd anticipated when Dad co-signed the loans. They were looking at consolidating debt, but their credit scores weren't good enough to qualify for favorable terms. Jake wondered if I might be willing to co-sign a consolidation loan, since I probably had good credit from all my years of being so careful with money. The request was presented as a family favor, an opportunity for me to help them get back on track after some understandable newlywed overspending. The irony was so complete that I almost laughed. Jake, who had received every financial advantage our parents could provide, was asking me who had been denied basic educational support to risk my credit rating to solve problems created by his privileged overconfidence. He was asking me to provide the same kind of family financial support that had been offered to him automatically, but denied to me consistently. I told Jake I couldn't co-sign any loans, but that I could offer some budgeting advice if he was interested. The suggestion clearly wasn't what he'd hoped for, and his tone shifted from friendly to confused. He seemed genuinely surprised that I wouldn't help, as if my years of self-reliance had been preparation for eventually supporting the family members who'd never supported me. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Jake saying he'd think about the budgeting advice offer and get back to me. He never did. But 3 days later, Mom called with a tone I'd never heard before, concerned. Almost anxious. Mom explained that Jake had mentioned our conversation, and she was worried there might have been some misunderstanding. She assured me that Jake wasn't asking for money, just family support during a difficult time. When I confirmed that he'd asked me to co-sign a loan, she became defensive, insisting that family members help each other when possible. I asked Mom if she remembered refusing to help me buy textbooks while co-signing Jake's fourth car loan. The question created a silence that lasted so long I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally responded, her voice was different, smaller, less certain. Mom said she didn't remember the textbook situation the same way I did, and that the car loans were different because they were investments in Jake's future. When I asked how textbooks weren't an investment in my future, she said I'd always been so independent and capable that they'd assumed I could handle things on my own. The explanation revealed everything I'd suspected but never had confirmed. My parents had interpreted my resilience as evidence that I didn't need support, while interpreting Jake's demands as evidence that he did. My success, despite their lack of help, had justified their decision not to help, while Jake's struggles, despite their constant help, justified giving him more. I told Mom that I understood their reasoning, but that I wouldn't be co-signing any loans or providing financial support to family members who'd never provided the same to me. The boundary was stated calmly, without anger or accusation, but with complete firmness. Mom's response was immediate and revealing. She said she was disappointed in my attitude, that family was supposed to be more important than money, and that she'd expected better from me given all the opportunities I'd been given. The irony of being lectured about family support by someone who'd systematically denied me family support was stunning in its lack of self-awareness. I ended that phone call with the recognition that my parents would never acknowledge the differential treatment I'd experienced. They had created a narrative where Jake was the child who needed support, and I was the child who was strong enough not to need it. My success had become proof that their approach was correct, rather than evidence of what I could have achieved with their support. A week later, I closed on my house. The process was smooth, professional, and entirely mine. I walked through my new home with keys that no one else owned, in a space that no one else had opinions about, making plans that no one else could veto or criticize. The freedom was intoxicating. I spent the weekend painting my living room a color I loved, setting up a home office in the second bedroom, and planting herbs in containers on my back porch. Every decision was mine, funded by money I'd earned, in a space I'd chosen. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely autonomous. Dad called the following Tuesday with what he presented as congratulations on my home purchase, though I suspected Mom had told him to call. His tone was awkward, as if he wasn't sure how to navigate a conversation where he wasn't being asked for anything and didn't have anything to offer. The conversation was stilted until Dad mentioned that he'd heard I wasn't willing to help Jake with his financial situation. His phrasing was careful, but the implication was clear. I was being selfish by refusing to support family after all the support family had given me. For the first time in my life, I decided to address the elephant directly. I told Dad that I'd never received the kind of support I was being asked to provide, and that I wasn't comfortable taking financial risks for someone who'd been given every advantage while I'd been given every obstacle. Dad's response was immediate denial. He insisted that he and Mom had always treated all their children equally, that any differences in support had been based on different needs and circumstances. When I mentioned the textbook incident specifically, he said he didn't remember it that way, and that I'd always been so independent that they'd tried not to interfere with my self-sufficiency. I asked Dad if he remembered co-signing Jake's car loans, and he said those were different because Jake had needed reliable transportation for work. When I pointed out that I'd needed textbooks for education, he said education was my responsibility, while transportation had been a family safety issue. The conversation continued for 30 minutes, with Dad providing increasingly creative explanations for why every instance of support for Jake had been necessary, while every request from me had been unnecessary. The mental gymnastics were impressive, but the underlying message was clear. Jake was inherently worthy of support, and I was inherently capable of handling things alone. I finally told Dad that I understood his position, but that I would not be providing financial support to family members while also accepting responsibility for my own success, despite their lack of support. The boundary was stated clearly, without room for negotiation or misunderstanding. Dad's final response was telling. He said he was disappointed that success had made me forget about family, and that he'd hoped I would use my advantages to help people who'd helped me along the way. The revisionist history was stunning. He'd created a narrative where they had helped me, and my success was somehow due to their support rather than achieved despite their lack of it. I hung up that phone call with the recognition that my family would never acknowledge the reality of our shared history. They had constructed a version of events where they were supportive parents who'd raised successful children, rather than parents who'd consistently favored one child while demanding that the unfavored children still contribute to family welfare. 6 months later, Emma called me for the first time in 3 years. She'd heard about my house purchase through Mom and wanted to congratulate me directly. Our conversation was tentative at first, but gradually became the most honest discussion I'd ever had with a family member. Emma had experienced almost identical treatment during her college years and early career. She'd been denied support while watching Jake receive everything, had been expected to fund her own education while his was subsidized, had been told she was too independent to need help while he was given help preemptively. The validation was overwhelming. For the first time, I had confirmation from someone who'd witnessed the same dynamics that I wasn't imagining the differential treatment. Emma had moved across the country partially to escape the emotional exhaustion of trying to maintain relationships with people who'd never invested equally in her. Emma and I started talking regularly after that, building a relationship based on mutual respect and shared understanding rather than family obligation. She'd built a successful consulting business, bought her own home, and created a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or support. Like me, she'd learned to value relationships based on reciprocity rather than blood relation. A year after buying my house, I received a promotion that came with a significant salary increase and stock options that could be worth substantial money if the company continued growing. The recognition was based purely on my contributions and potential, without any consideration of my family background or personal circumstances. I celebrated the promotion by taking a 2-week vacation to Japan, something I'd dreamed about since graduate school but never thought I could afford. The trip was everything I'd hoped: beautiful, educational, and completely mine to enjoy without justifying the expense to anyone else. When I returned from Japan, I found 3 missed calls from Mom and a voicemail asking me to call back about an important family matter. The tone was more serious than usual, which made me wonder if someone was sick or if there'd been an emergency. I called back the next evening, and Mom explained that Jake and his wife were facing foreclosure on their house. They'd fallen behind on mortgage payments during a period when Jake had been between jobs, and now they owed more than they could catch up on their current income. Dad had helped what he could, but it wasn't enough to save the house. The family was trying to figure out options, and Mom wondered if I might be willing to provide a loan to help Jake avoid foreclosure. The amount they needed was $15,000, which was substantial but within my means given my recent promotion and bonuses. Mom's presentation of the request was careful and emotional. She talked about how devastating it would be for Jake and his wife to lose their home, how it would affect their credit and future opportunities, how the whole family was worried about their situation. She positioned my potential help as a loan rather than a gift, with promises that I'd be repaid as soon as Jake got back on his feet financially. The request was exactly what I'd expected would eventually come. My success had been noted and filed away as a resource for future family emergencies, particularly emergencies involving Jake. The assumption was that I would want to help, that family obligation would override any concerns about the history of our relationship. I told Mom I would think about it and get back to her, which bought me time to process the request properly. I spent that evening walking through my neighborhood, thinking about the 15-year-old who'd been denied art supplies while Jake got premium music lessons, the college student who'd been refused textbook money while Jake got his fourth car co-signed. The pattern was crystal clear. When I'd needed help, I'd been told to find another way. When Jake needed help, it was presented as a family emergency requiring all available resources. My needs had always been minimized. His needs were always catastrophic. My independence had been assumed. His dependence was accommodated and enabled. I called Mom back 2 days later with my decision. I would not be providing a loan to help Jake avoid foreclosure, but I would be willing to share budgeting and financial planning resources if they were interested in addressing the underlying spending patterns that had created the crisis. Mom's response was immediate disappointment followed by confusion. She couldn't understand how I could watch family members lose their home when I had the means to help them. When I reminded her that she'd watched me struggle financially throughout college and graduate school without offering help, she said those situations were different because I'd always managed to figure things out. The circular reasoning was perfect in its consistency. My resilience in handling problems without family support proved that I didn't need family support. Jake's inability to handle problems without family support proved that he needed family support. The fact that I'd succeeded despite being denied help meant I should now provide help to someone who'd always received it. I maintained my boundary, and the conversation ended with Mom saying she hoped I'd reconsider because family was more important than money. The ironic lecture from someone who'd consistently prioritized Jake's financial wants over my financial needs was remarkable in its lack of self-awareness. Jake lost the house 6 weeks later. Dad called to update me on the situation, and his tone carried a subtle implication that the outcome could have been prevented if I'd chosen to help. The guilt attempt was obvious but ineffective. I'd learned to separate other people's choices and consequences from my own decisions and boundaries. The foreclosure became a family crisis that consumed everyone's attention except mine. Jake and his wife moved in with our parents temporarily while they figured out next steps. Dad took out a second mortgage on his own home to help Jake with moving expenses and debt consolidation. Mom started working part-time to help cover the additional household expenses. I watched the family mobilize around Jake's crisis with the same detached interest I'd learned to apply to all their dynamics. The level of support, sacrifice, and financial risk they were willing to take for Jake was identical to the level of support they'd denied me throughout my educational career. The contrast was so stark that it eliminated any remaining doubt about the reality of my childhood experience. 6 months later, I received news that my research team's patent application had been approved, and the company was licensing the technology to manufacturers worldwide. My share of the licensing fees would be substantial, enough to pay off my mortgage completely and still have significant money for investments. I celebrated the patent approval with Dr. Martinez, who'd remained a mentor and friend throughout my career. She was proud of my technical achievement, but even more proud of the personal growth I'd demonstrated in setting boundaries with family members who'd never recognized my worth. Dr. Martinez had watched me transform from an overworked graduate student desperate for approval into a confident professional who valued herself appropriately. The change hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been necessary for my long-term well-being and success. With the patent money, I paid off my mortgage and bought investment properties that would provide passive income for years to come. I started a scholarship fund at my undergraduate university specifically for students whose families couldn't or wouldn't provide educational support. The scholarship criteria were carefully written to identify students like I'd been, academically excellent but financially unsupported due to family dysfunction rather than genuine poverty. The scholarship fund became a way to transform my painful experience into something meaningful for other people facing similar challenges. Every student who received support because their family had failed to provide it represented a victory over the system that had tried to convince me I wasn't worth investing in. 2 years after establishing the scholarship fund, I was invited to speak at the university's annual donor recognition dinner. My remarks focused on the importance of supporting students who demonstrate resilience and excellence despite challenging family circumstances, students who've learned to succeed independently because dependence wasn't an option. After my speech, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She was a junior majoring in engineering, working 30 hours a week to pay for school, while her parents funded her brother's graduate degree in a program he'd chosen on a whim. My scholarship had covered her textbooks and lab fees for the semester, removing just enough financial pressure to let her focus on academics rather than survival. Her story was so similar to mine that I felt like I was talking to my 20-year-old self. The difference was that she had support I'd never had, validation I'd never received, and financial assistance that acknowledged her worth rather than questioning it. The scholarship had given her what my parents had refused to give me, recognition that her education was worth investing in. That conversation confirmed what I'd suspected about my family's treatment. It wasn't normal, it wasn't justified, and it wasn't my fault. Other families invested in all their children's education. Other parents recognized academic achievement as worthy of support. Other siblings didn't have to earn what was freely given elsewhere. Last month, Dad called with news that he'd been diagnosed with a serious medical condition requiring expensive treatment. His insurance would cover most costs, but there would still be significant out-of-pocket expenses for medications and specialized care. He mentioned the diagnosis matter-of-factly, without directly asking for help, but with clear implications about the financial burden. The call felt like a test of everything I'd learned about boundaries and self-respect. The man who'd refused to spend $320 on my textbooks was indirectly asking for financial support for medical bills that would cost thousands. The parent who'd never invested in my potential was expecting me to invest in his care. I responded with empathy for his health situation and practical suggestions for managing medical expenses, but no offer of financial assistance. When Dad seemed surprised by my lack of financial support offers, I reminded him that he'd taught me to handle my own problems independently, and I assumed he wanted to maintain the same self-reliance he'd always expected from me. The conversation was awkward but revealing. Dad seemed genuinely confused by my unwillingness to provide financial support, as if the years of refusing support to me had no connection to my current refusal to support him. The possibility that his past choices might influence my current decisions hadn't occurred to him. I ended the call with well wishes for his health and a reminder that I'd learned financial independence from his example. The boundary was maintained without cruelty, but also without the kind of support that had never been available to me when I'd needed it. That phone call crystallized everything I'd learned about family dynamics and self-worth. People who refuse to invest in you don't get to withdraw from your success. People who teach you to be independent don't get to be dependent on you. People who consistently prioritize others over you don't get to make themselves your priority when convenient. Today, I'm 32 years old and more financially secure than I ever imagined possible. I own my home outright, have substantial savings and investments, and earn more money than my parents ever did. My career success has been built entirely on my own efforts, without family connections, financial support, or safety nets. More importantly, I've learned to value relationships based on reciprocity, respect, and genuine care rather than blood relation or social expectation. Emma and I have built a strong, sisterly relationship based on mutual support and understanding. I have friends who celebrate my successes genuinely and offer help when I need it, just as I do for them. I still maintain polite contact with my parents, but with clear boundaries and realistic expectations. I don't expect them to acknowledge their past favoritism or apologize for their lack of support. I don't expect them to celebrate my achievements with the enthusiasm they reserve for Jake's. I don't expect them to prioritize my needs when Jake's needs are competing for their attention. What I've learned is that you can't change other people's priorities, but you can stop making their priorities more important than your own well-being. You can't force people to value you appropriately, but you can refuse to undervalue yourself to accommodate their limitations. You can't control how family members treat you, but you can control how much access they have to your emotional and financial resources. The Scholarship Fund now supports 12 students annually, young people who remind me that resilience isn't a character flaw and independence isn't a punishment. These students are learning what I wish I'd known at their age, that their worth isn't determined by their family's investment in them, and their success doesn't require anyone else's approval or support. If you're watching this and recognizing your own story and mine, please know that you're not imagining the differential treatment you've experienced. You're not too sensitive, too demanding, or too ungrateful. Family favoritism is real, systematic, and devastating to the unfavored children who spend years trying to earn what others receive automatically. Your worth doesn't depend on your family's recognition of it. Your success doesn't require their support. Your happiness doesn't need their approval. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the permission to stop trying to earn something that should have been freely given and start building a life based on your own values rather than their expectations. I'd love to hear from others who've navigated similar family dynamics. How did you recognize the favoritism patterns? What boundaries have you established with family members who consistently undervalued you? How have you learned to celebrate your own achievements when your family reserves their celebrations for others? If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more content about family dynamics, personal growth, and building authentic relationships. Sometimes the most important family you'll ever have is the one you choose for yourself, and that's not just okay, it's exactly as it should be.